Many of you saw this interview right here about Thomas Sowell when he was swearing mad. That took place in San Francisco in 1980 during a speech he was giving at the Fairmont conference. They showed a few clips from that presentation. A lot of you have been asking for the full speech, and this was a tricky one to do because there's a video version that is highly edited and cut up, and then there's a full audio version that's audio only. So what I did was I interspliced them so you guys have the entire speech, and when there's the video segment, that fades in and you can see the full video, then back to audio, then back to video. You'll see, it's great. Also, I have Milton Friedman's full speech from that same conference as well. We'll start off with Milton, then get into Thomas. I hope you guys enjoy this one. Thank you so much.
I'm very glad to be with all the rest of the outcasts here tonight. The theme of my remarks was really set by Oscar Wright last night when he referred to himself as an outcast. And he and I, and a good many of us in this room, are outcasts in more than one sense. We are both, he and I, members of a persecuted ethnic group. I of a Jewish group that has been persecuted throughout the ages. He of a black group that has been persecuted throughout the ages. But we are outcasts in an even more fundamental way, because we are outcasts within our own ethnic group. As you know, for a very long time, the Jews, than whom no people have benefited so much from the free market, have been among the foremost opponents of a free market. And in that respect, I have been an outcast within the ethnic group because I disagree with the idea that the way the Jews or any other persecuted group can benefit themselves or improve their conditions is by relying on the goodwill of the majority that is prejudiced against them. Oscar is similarly a minority within, or an outcast within his ethnic group, because he too believes that the way in which the blacks can improve their conditions is by fending for themselves, becoming responsible individually, and not by relying on the great white father in Washington, or for that matter in Sacramento. It's interesting to note that with respect both to my persecuted minority and his, they have never achieved anything fundamentally improving their lot by virtue of the intervention of the government. They have achieved what they have achieved despite governmental efforts rather than the other way. They have achieved it by relying on voluntary exchange, and they have profited most in those societies and in those areas of the society where there was a greatest degree of freedom for individuals to pursue their own objectives without let or hindrance. We have had a great deal of talk here, and a good talk, an excellent talk, much of it, about the problem of poverty, of high black teenage unemployment, about the underclass in the black community. It's a major and a very real and deep problem, but I ask you to consider for a moment the basic sources of that poverty and what's responsible for it. Number one, bad schooling. Who provides the schooling? Utterly disgraceful that you should have such low-quality schooling in areas which serve or are supposed to serve the underclass and the poor in the community, whether they be black or whether they be Hispano-Americans or what, Mexican-Americans or what. That you have bad schooling. Why? Because it's run by the government. Is there any area in your existence in which the blacks get as raw a deal as they do in schooling? A black who has enough money can buy the same kind of house almost anywhere. He's discriminated against, of course, but he can buy a house which is much better, relatively speaking, to what a white can buy than the kind of schooling he can get. He can buy the same automobile. He can shop at the same stores. But even if he has the money, it's extremely difficult for him to get the same quality of schooling. In order to do that, he has to have enough money to be able to move where he probably doesn't want to move. I keep asking black leaders around this country whenever I meet them, where do you send your children to school? They send them to private schools. They don't send them to government schools. So you have bad schooling because it's provided by the government and because the poor people of this country have no other alternative. Those of us who are in the upper or middle classes, we can afford to pay twice for schooling. Once in taxes and once by paying tuition. But the poor fellows in the ghettos and the slums of this country cannot afford to pay twice for schooling, and that's why they have bad schooling. If you go from schooling, what's the next major source of the so-called underclass? Government, welfare, and public assistance programs. Programs which are erected in the name of helping the poor, but which have the effect that once anybody is so unfortunate as to have to depend on those programs, it's very difficult for him to get out of that situation. So instead of this being a temporary problem, it tends to become a permanent one. Now, obviously, that's not true of all of them by any manner of means. And I'm not saying that's a black problem. It's a problem of poor people, whether they're black or white or any other color. And many of them do surmount that. But for many, you have established a culture of poverty because it's so difficult to get out from under. What is the next major source of poverty? Housing. Why do you have such bad housing? You have it in the first place because the federal government subsidized people to move out in the suburbs with the veterans housing loans, with the subsidized housing, with the FHA, with Fannie Mae and all the rest. That was a program to subsidize owned homes, almost all in the suburbs, and to encourage people to move out of the central cities. And then you had an urban removal program, which Marty Anderson, who was here, wrote the definitive work on, the federal bulldozer, which quite properly has become called a Negro removal program. You have a fourth source of poverty, which is the one that Walter Williams talked about earlier. In the first place, government schools turn out youngsters who are not educated and who don't have any skills. And then to add insult to injury, we say to employers, you must discriminate against those people. You cannot hire them unless you are willing to give them charity. Because if they're so poorly educated and trained and skilled that they're not worth in the market, the product they produce is not worth $3.10 an hour, you may hire them provided you make up the difference out of your pocket. And so the minimum wage laws, the trade union restrictions, the kind of taxi cab restrictions, every single one of these major sources of poverty is produced by government. Now, what's the way out of it? And that's where I think I have the greatest difference with many of the statements that were made today on this, in this program. If you think that there's a way out of this by getting government to pass laws especially to benefit the blacks, you're kidding yourself. That isn't going to happen. I want to read to you something which I wrote close to 20 years ago, which was published about 18 years ago in a book called Capitalism and Freedom, in which I was discussing the relation between capitalism and discrimination. And I wrote, and I quote, FEPC legislation, Fair Employment Practices Commission legislation, involves the acceptance of a principle that proponents would find abhorrent in almost every other application. If it is appropriate for the state to say that individuals may not discriminate in employment because of color or race or religion, then it is equally appropriate for the state, provided a majority can be found to vote that way, to say that individuals must discriminate in employment on the basis of color, race, or religion. Now, you will all recognize that that is exactly what has happened in the interim, as you have moved from the idea of non-discrimination to the idea of affirmative action. Temporarily, that affirmative action may benefit some blacks, some low-income people. But if you believe that Supreme Court decisions are going to be able to stop a majority of the population which is prejudiced from using this power to benefit themselves rather than the people who are disadvantaged, you're kidding yourself. That's not the way out. What is the way out? I think the way out is a very different one from the part of all of us who are interested in the people who are disadvantaged in our society. There are black problems that are peculiar to the black community, just as there are Jewish problems that are peculiar to the Jewish community. Baptist problems that are peculiar to the Baptist community. But those problems are problems that should be worked on by these communities among their own people by themselves through voluntary activities. And I think the only way we can make progress is by recognizing that from the point of view of political tactics, the only problems we have to deal with are human problems. I come to a point. One of the most important comments that were made all day was made by Professor Osborne when he said, how do we make it politically profitable to change the rules of the game? How do we make it politically profitable for those people who are in power to alter arrangements? Now, we do not make it politically profitable for them by asking a majority of the people to vote burdens on themselves to benefit a minority. You may for a time get away with it, but you won't get away with it for long. You make it politically profitable by using your energies to promote programs to solve human problems, which affect everybody, so that you can organize a coalition for programs that are not to benefit the blacks, not to benefit the Puerto Ricans, not to benefit any special group, but to benefit a wide class of people. Let me illustrate with the case of schooling. I do not think you're going to get anywhere in promoting schooling, by much as I sympathize with the objectives of Oscar Wright. I don't think you're going to get anywhere by promoting community independence, separation. As I told Oscar Wright, if he goes that way, he's going to end up being a front man for interests he doesn't want to front for. Unless the separate community is going to provide its own financing along the lines that Bob Hawkins talked about this afternoon, if it's going to believe it's going to be politically independent when somebody else is paying the purse, it's got another thing coming. That's not the way to solve it. On the other hand, if you go the way of vouchers, it's not merely that that's complete decentralization, that goes to parents, but then you're talking about something. That you've got a group of Catholics here that are very much interested in that. You've got a group of Jews here who are very much interested in their schools. You've got all the parents of the country. Go around this country. Oscar and others have talked about the great opposition to compulsory busing. There's just as wide a consensus that public schooling is not producing what parents expect of it. And so a voucher scheme is not a black scheme. It's not a Catholic scheme. It's a scheme to solve a human problem and to provide everybody around the country, every parent around the country, with an opportunity to have greater control over the kind of schools his children go to. And that's the way it seems to me we can make it politically profitable, by having measures that have the property that you can get a coalition in back of it. The same thing is true in case after case. The great virtue of moving to eliminate barriers, of trying to get rid of things like the minimum wage, like restrictions on taxi cabs and so on, is that you can generalize them, that you can make them into a general principle, that you can get people to adopt and to follow and to pursue, because they appeal to a much wider range of interests, because they're a satisfactory fundamental principle. And I believe it's only by moving in that direction that you can possibly achieve the kind of objectives that all of us want to achieve. If you look, and here are the stuff that Tom has done outside of schooling is fascinating. If you look at the ethnic groups in this country, that have succeeded and have done well. You name me one of them that has had that success as a result of special attention by government. The Jews certainly did not succeed because they were getting special government privilege. The Japanese did not succeed on that ground. The Chinese did not succeed on that ground. They succeeded by taking advantages of the opportunities that the private market offered to them. And I think this is a subject that has very widespread interest. You will not get great support on the part of the community if you ask 86% of the people to tax themselves more heavily to help the other 14%. But if you say to 100% of the people we want lower taxes, we want a freer society, we want a smaller government, we want to get government off our back, then you've got a lot of allies. And it seems to me that that's the only effective way in which we can work to achieve our objectives. Now, I come back to my initial theme. I have been an outcast for a very long time and in many different groups. And one of the things that has been fascinating to me in my experience is the strength and power of ideas as opposed to numbers. Numbers have never accounted for anything. Ideas, good ideas, right ideas really count for something. And I have seen an area, and in numbers of different areas, the outcasts become the majority. And they become the majority because they are the ones who have what's needed to solve the problems. And the outcasts who are in this room, I think, will be destined to become the majority, not because you get payoffs in the political scene, not because by voting for the right party you get a job that you couldn't otherwise get. See, I come back to what Tony here said this afternoon, a quid pro quo on an individual basis. But if you think that you're going to improve the lot of the minority of Americans who are black by quid pro quos on a political basis, I don't care whether it's Democrats or Republicans, you're kidding yourself. The other 86% will have more quids. You don't have enough quids for that. But you can become a majority, or be with the majority, if you take advantage of the new ideas, of the ideas that are bubbling up in this group, the kinds of ideas that you've been talking about today, and recognize the extent to which they are appropriate for human problems that reach beyond the black community. And in that case, the outcasts will become the majority. Thank you.
This is really an historic opportunity. The economic and social advancement of blacks in this country is still a great unfinished task. The methods and approaches for dealing with this task have become familiar over the past few years, and they demand re-examination for at least two reasons. First is the effectiveness of these approaches has been ever more seriously questioned in recent years. There's growing factual evidence of counterproductive results from noble intentions. Some of that factual evidence will be presented here tomorrow. In addition, numerous political trends in recent years indicate declining voter and taxpayer support for these approaches to which some of the older and more conventional black spokesmen, in quotes, remain committed. The events of November 4th were only the most dramatic example of this. They were not the only example. In California, we remember Proposition 13. Across the country, the defeat of school bond issues and spending proposals. With the coming elections, the shifting fortunes of partisan politics may change the party labels of those in power, but Camelot seems unlikely to return, and we certainly cannot bet the future of 20 million people on its return. So there is a historic responsibility implied. We cannot simply run around claiming that the sky is falling, popular as that sometimes seems, because that approach implies that there is one approach which is the only approach. It implies that the partisans of that approach have some monopoly of either wisdom or virtue, which may be a convenient assumption for them, but no reason why the rest of us should take it seriously. What is a more responsible approach? First, we need to recognize that many methods were failing even before they lost public support. We have to accept the challenge of re-examining why these approaches were failing. We need to accept the responsibility of seeking new approaches, devising new policies for the decade ahead. That's why we're here, to explore alternatives, not to create a new orthodoxy with its own messiahs and its own excommunications of those who dare to think for themselves. The people who are invited to be presenters and discussants are people who are seeking alternatives, people who have challenged the conventional wisdom on one or more issues, people who have thought for themselves instead of marching in step and chanting the familiar refrains. The various speakers and discussants have varying philosophies and different areas of expertise. Some are Democrats, some are Republicans, and some, like myself, are neither. We're here to assess where we are, where we are going, and what are our alternatives. We can start with looking at the present situation. We've come through an historic phase of struggle for basic civil rights, a very necessary struggle, but not sufficient. The very success of that struggle has created new priorities and new urgencies. There are economic realities to confront, self-development to achieve, in the schools, at work, and in our communities. The sins of others are always fascinating to human beings, but they are not always the best way to self-development or self-advancement. The moral regeneration of white people might be an interesting project, but I am not sure we have quite that much time to spare. Those who have fought on that front are very much like the generals who like to refight the last war instead of preparing for the next struggle. What are some of the pluses and minuses of our present situation? On the plus side, a dramatic economic rise of blacks during the 1960s, but which is slowed, in some cases stopped, in the 1970s. Many social problems are worsening. Continued disintegration of families, rising numbers of broken homes, 1/3 of all black homes now. A skyrocketing unemployment rate among black youths, 5 times as high in the late 1970s as in the late 1940s. Runaway crime rates, of which blacks are the chief victims. There are more blacks murdered every year than whites in absolute numbers. There's also a threat of a permanent underclass whose problems seem immune to prosperity, to equal opportunity, or to the advancement experienced by other blacks. We can see on the horizon the rise of racist groups such as the Nazis, the KKK, not only among the benighted, ignorant, but in places where you would never expect such groups, where they never had a foothold before. We can at least ask whether or to what extent the policies of our times have contributed to these problems of our time. Looking ahead to the future, one of the things that we need to focus on are facts about results, not rhetoric about intentions. We need to look not at the noble preambles of legislation, but at the incentives created in that legislation. Very often legislation intended to help the disadvantaged, in fact, pay people to stay disadvantaged, penalize them to the extent that they make an effort to rise from disadvantage. I mentioned that in the 1960s there was a dramatic increase in black income relative to white, dramatic increase of blacks in high-level occupations, and that much of this has slowed down, in some cases stopped in the 70s. We need to ask whether the policies that were followed in the 70s had anything to do with this. The question is not whether, on the one hand, affirmative action sounds better than equal opportunity, but whether, in fact, the results show further progress or are slowing down. There are some serious economic reasons why that would be so. When we talk about rent control, we need not be satisfied with cliches about affordable housing. We need to ask the factual question, will there be more housing or less under rent control? When we talk about minimum wage laws, we need to ask not whether a decent wage is a good objective, but whether there will be more jobs at higher pay or no jobs and no pay for increasing numbers of people. If we're going to talk about the future, we have to talk responsibly. We have to have a responsible dialogue with those who disagree with us. If you're serious, it means you're not concerned with scoring points. You're concerned with confronting the actual arguments, not straw men. We don't need to talk about trickle-down theories. I know of no one who has set forth a trickle-down theory. I know of many people who set that up as a straw man to avoid confronting the arguments that have been set forth by those who want to depend upon different mechanisms, different processes from the ones that are in fashion. One of the other cliches of our times is the bootstrap theory, the notion that those who don't support the current agenda, current political agenda, believe that people should lift themselves by their own bootstraps, should be left to their own devices, that the government is doing too much to help them. There is no such theory. I've been around a few conservative economists in my time, and I've listened, and I've never heard it. I haven't seen it anywhere in history, but I see it as a convenient straw man for people who don't want to confront opposite views. We have in our midst tonight Professor Milton Friedman, who has advocated negative income taxes, vouchers, and other kinds of schemes to benefit the poor. One may argue for or against those schemes. One may argue more safely against them when he's not present. But the issue is not that the government gives too much help to the poor. The problem is that the government creates too much harm to the poor. The cost of taking care of the poor is a relatively small cost compared to the cost of bureaucracy. Some years ago, someone figured out how much it would cost the government to lift every man, woman, and child in the United States out of poverty by the simple expedient of giving them money. That amount that they came to was approximately 1/3 of what is spent on anti-poverty programs. My colleague, Walter Williams, has figured out how much the welfare expenditure in this country comes to per poor family. It is $32,000. Very few poor families get $32,000. One of the other devices that's often used is to argue that those people who are opposed to the welfare state approach are simply middle class. I wish I had $1 for every time I've been asked, did I come from an affluent background? And is that why I have such an unfeeling heart for the problems of the poor? I have never heard that question asked of Andrew Young, who indeed did come from an affluent background. Some time ago, I met with a well-known TV newsman, and I asked him, why is it that when I look on television and I see what black spokesmen are saying, that I see them saying diametrically the opposite of what I hear in the black community, what I see in Gallup polls and other polls. For example, that blacks in this country support voucher systems 2-to-1. Blacks in this country prefer more strict enforcement of crime laws, are opposed to quota systems in employment or college admission, and have never had a majority in favor of busing. And yet when I look at the TV news, an entirely different world is created before my eyes on that tube. And he said to me, well, we can put Ben Hooks or Jesse Jackson on TV, but we can't put the Gallup poll on TV. One of the consequences of this is that we're having, in addition to the usual conflicts among groups that any multi-ethnic or multiracial society has, we're having artificial polarization. We're having polarization between a handful of black leaders and a handful of white leaders, many saying things which have very little to do with the beliefs of the people in whose name they're speaking. If we're looking at the future and looking responsibly, we can learn much from the experience of others, which does not mean blind imitation. Sometimes it means avoiding the mistakes that others have made. Many of the very policies that I hear being urged as the royal road to salvation for blacks today are policies that were tried and failed repeatedly by the Irish in the 19th century. It's true that the black history is unique, but of course you'd have to make comparisons even to know that. And uniqueness is never a reason to avoid learning at someone else's expense rather than at your own. One of the problems that I see is the problem of the political interventionist state. And I pose it in its categorical terms as if there's some non-interventionist state. We're really talking about different degrees. There seems to be a notion that political interventionism that produces earmarked benefits for this group or that necessarily make those groups better off. But when you think of it, no politician gets elected by sacrificing 90% of the voters for the benefit of 10% of the voters. One thing that all politicians can do, of whatever party, is count votes. They may create the illusion that they are helping 10%. Indeed, the ideal politician creates that illusion 10 times. But since the government is not generating any wealth, government programs mean nothing more or less than robbing Peter to pay Paul. Now, there's no political capital to be made by robbing Peter to pay Paul if you get Peter's vote and lose Paul's vote. The real trick is to rob Peter to pay Paul on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and rob Paul to pay Peter on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Fortunately, the government is closed on Sunday. By following this strategy, you can give a little bit to this group, a little bit to that group, and none of them ever ask, is what is given to A taken from B, and what is given from B to B taken from A? Let's look at some of the losses that blacks suffer from the interventionist state. I think the greatest single loss is that the minimum wage laws promoted by labor unions protect their members by pricing black young people out of the market. There's no way to rise up the ladder if you can't get your foot on the ladder in the first place. Environmentalism, to use the word they like to use, I like to call it the recreational land use special interest. For the benefit of a relatively small group of people, we have set aside vast areas of the United States, an amount equal to 1/3 of this country, which is to say equivalent to all of the United States east of the Mississippi. Clearly, you cannot set aside that much land, take it off the market, without having the price of the other land rise, and having that rise reflected in rents and mortgage costs all across the country. Of course, the government can come to your rescue with projects and subsidies, but of course, these don't begin to add up to what you have lost by this vast giveaway to a handful of affluent people. One of the great coups of the whole environmental movement is to avoid talking about people and trade-offs. You would never dream that there are people who have alternative demands for the same resource by reading the environmental literature. You hear about protecting the environment, protecting fragile areas. It's very touching. You would never dream that what that means is that one group of people will use the power of the government to put those vast resources at their disposal far below cost and keep them out of the hands of other people who have other uses for them. The recreational land that's set aside is land from which you do not build homes, from which you do not get energy, from which you do not create jobs. We have a protection of endangered species that's concerned with every weed and reptile. We also need to recognize that human beings are an endangered species, and especially those who are poor. There seems to be a notion that Darwinian evolution may have been a good idea at one time, but we're going to bring it to a screeching halt in our generation. That despite thousands of years in which all sorts of creatures have come into existence and gone out of existence, in which all sorts of ecologies have evolved, totally different from one another. For some reason, the particular creatures that we have seen, even if there's only a handful of us who've ever seen them actually, those creatures are to be preserved forever at all cost. The particular kind of ecology that happens to exist at this moment must be frozen for all future time. One of the problems in dealing with the politics of poverty and the programs for the disadvantaged in general, and blacks in particular, is that vast empires can be built on these programs. That these programs definitely prevent poverty among bureaucrats, economists, statisticians, and many others. The poor are also very useful as an entering wedge for programs which ultimately benefit other people who are by no stretch of the imagination poor. That the poor, that blacks, are guinea pigs. They are subjects out there for every, quote, innovative, unquote, idea that pops into the head of some academic. That they are there to provide raw material for surveys, schemes of various sorts. Above all, that their freedom of choice is to be denied in order to correspond to the grand designs of people who think they know better. One of the remarkable editorials that I saw a few years ago appeared in the New Republic as an argument against vouchers. And the argument was that if you had vouchers, then those black parents who were most concerned about their children and most knowledgeable would pull their children out of the public schools, leaving behind only those who didn't care, or whose parents didn't care. And presumably the New Republic thought that was a terrible thing to have done, that while every other group in this country has risen layer by layer as different people began to seize opportunities, blacks alone must all be held back until such time as the very last person in line has understood the value of education. I think that what this betrays is a sense, a sort of proprietary conception of blacks, somewhat at variance with the spirit of the 13th Amendment. I think that if insofar as we're going to enlist the intelligence, the desires, and the commitments of blacks themselves, we have to do so by offering more choice in more areas, to let them decide what is best for themselves and not to turn that job over to academics and government officials. Thank you.